The polished mahogany door stood as a monument to a history Richard never truly understood. Its heavy brass knocker, shaped like a lion's head, gleamed under the afternoon sun, a silent guardian of a legacy he believed he had conquered. The chime of the doorbell was not timid or pleading. It was crisp, deliberate, and final. Inside, Richard Monroe, a man who measured his worth in stock prices and corporate takeovers, swirled a glass of vintage champagne, a triumphant smirk playing on his lips. He opened the door, ready to dismiss a delivery or a lost tourist, but the smirk froze, then melted away into a mask of pure disbelief. Standing before him was Laura, the wife he had discarded like a worn-out accessory 2 weeks prior. She wasn't weeping or begging. She was dressed in a tailored navy blue tower suit, her posture radiating an unshakable calm. Flanking her were 2 broad-shouldered men in discreet but imposing security uniforms. He thought he had taken everything from her, her home, her dignity, her future. He had no idea he was about to be evicted from a house that was never his to give away. Richard's face contorted with a mixture of shock and fury, his voice a low growl that barely concealed his rising panic. "Laura, what is the meaning of this? Are you insane?" He tried to slam the heavy door shut, a petty act of control, but one of the security guards placed a firm, unmovable hand against the wood. The door didn't budge. Richard's illusion of absolute power shattered against that simple physical resistance. He sputtered, his carefully constructed composure crumbling. "This is my house. You are trespassing. I'm calling the police." Laura simply watched him, her expression unreadable, a placid lake concealing untold depths. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her silence was more powerful than his rage. In that moment, he was the king of a castle whose foundations were crumbling beneath his feet, and she was the architect of his downfall, holding the original blueprints that he had been too arrogant to ever consult. The air crackled with the tension of a battle already won, though he was only just realizing the war had begun without him even knowing. To understand the quiet, unyielding steel in Laura's eyes, one must travel back 14 days to a Saturday that had begun with the familiar, comforting scent of brewing coffee and blooming roses from the garden. The sunlight streamed through the tall, arched windows of the living room, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air and casting a warm glow on the antique furniture that had been in her family for generations. Each piece told a story: the worn armchair where her father used to read, the grand piano she learned to play as a child, the towering bookshelves filled with leather-bound classics. This house was not merely a structure of brick and mortar, it was a living archive of her life, a sanctuary of memories Richard had promised to cherish. He had entered her world, a man of sharp ambition and boundless energy, and she had believed his promises, seeing his success as their shared victory. She had no reason to suspect that the very foundation of her world was about to be ripped out from under her with a casual cruelty that would redefine everything she thought she knew about the man she had loved. He didn't arrive alone. The click of unfamiliar high heels on the marble foyer was the first sign that something was terribly wrong. Richard strode in, his face a mask of cold indifference, and beside him was Jessica, a woman half his age, dripping with designer labels and a predatory gleam in her eyes. Laura stood frozen, a porcelain teacup trembling in her hand. Richard didn't bother with pleasantries or excuses. His words were like shards of ice. "Laura, pack a bag. You have 2 hours." He tossed a platinum corporate credit card on the polished surface of a coffee table that had belonged to her grandmother. The metallic clatter echoed in the sudden suffocating silence. "Be reasonable. Get yourself a nice condo. The new lady of the house is here," he gestured to Jessica, "and she has much better taste." The humiliation was a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. It wasn't just a betrayal, it was a public execution of her role, her history, and her very identity, all performed on the sacred ground of her own home. The scene was made infinitely more painful by the presence of Maria, their housekeeper of 20 years, who stood by the doorway, her face a portrait of horrified pity. She quickly averted her eyes, unable to watch her mistress be so thoroughly dismantled, yet her presence confirmed the public nature of the shaming. This was a spectacle, and Laura was the unwilling star. Jessica, meanwhile, savored every second. She glided through the room, her fingers tracing the spines of old books and the curve of a porcelain vase, a conqueror assessing her new territory. "This whole room is so dated," she announced with a dismissive wave of her hand. "We'll have to gut it. I'm thinking something much more minimalist, all white and chrome." Each word was a calculated strike,
designed to erase Laura's existence, to tell her that her life, her taste, her very being was obsolete and would be discarded along with the furniture. Richard watched, his arms crossed, a silent endorsement of the desecration of a life he had once sworn to protect, his arrogance blinding him to the profound sacrilege of his actions.
In that moment, Laura felt an emotional wound so deep it seemed to sever her from her own past. It wasn't just about the infidelity or the loss of a luxurious home. It was the complete and utter invalidation of 25 years of sacrifice. She had set aside her own ambitions to support his, hosted his business partners, raised their children in this very house, and managed the estate with a quiet competence he had always taken for granted. She was the invisible scaffolding that held up the grand edifice of his success, and now he was tearing it down without a second thought, replacing her as if she were nothing more than outdated decor. Her gaze drifted to the oil portrait of her father hanging above the fireplace, his kind eyes seeming to look down at her with sorrow. This house was his wedding gift, his legacy to her, a promise of security, and Richard was giving it away to his mistress, turning her father's ultimate act of love into the stage for her ultimate humiliation. She felt herself shrinking, becoming transparent, a ghost in her own life story. But as she walked up the grand staircase, each step a monumental effort against the weight of her grief, something shifted. While Richard and Jessica's laughter echoed from below, a cold, clear anger began to crystallize in her heart, displacing the shock and despair. He saw a broken woman, defeated and compliant, dutifully packing a small suitcase as instructed. He couldn't see the gears turning in her mind, the memories resurfacing with sudden, sharp clarity. She remembered a day long ago, in a dusty lawyer's office, her father placing a heavy leather-bound folio in her hands. "This is your security, sweetheart," he had told her, his voice firm. "This place is yours and yours alone. No man, not even a husband, can ever take it from you. Don't you ever forget that." For years she had forgotten, lulled into a false sense of shared ownership and partnership. But now his words returned to her, not as a distant memory, but as a lifeline, a weapon, a promise of justice waiting to be claimed. Richard's greatest mistake wasn't his cruelty. It was his profound, arrogant underestimation of the woman he thought he knew. If you believe that arrogance like Richard's deserves a swift and elegant reckoning, and that a woman's quiet strength is often the most underestimated and powerful force in the world, then you are in exactly the right place. Stories like Laura's are why this channel exists, to celebrate the moment when the overlooked and undervalued finally turn the tables. So make sure you subscribe and hit that notification bell, because you won't want to miss seeing how justice is served. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. What would you have done in her position? And if you know someone who loves a story of empowerment, share this video with them. Richard gave his wife 2 hours to leave her home and her life behind. What he didn't know, as he watched her car disappear down the long tree-lined driveway, was that he was inadvertently giving her a 2-week head start to plan how she would take back everything that was rightfully hers, and so much more. Their story began not in a boardroom, but in a quiet university library, where Laura, with her gentle demeanor and a mind as sharp as a razor, first met Richard. He was a scholarship student, burning with an ambition that was almost palpable, a raw energy that contrasted sharply with the old-world grace of her upbringing. He was captivated by her, not just for her beauty, but for the history she represented, a lineage tied to the very foundations of the city. Laura, in turn, saw past his rough edges to the brilliant, determined man beneath. She believed in him with a fierce loyalty that would come to define her life. She introduced him to her influential circle, her name lending him a credibility his talent alone couldn't yet buy. Her father, a man who judged character with the precision of a watchmaker, saw Richard's relentless hunger and worried it might one day consume everything in its path. But Laura's love was a powerful advocate, and her family welcomed him, unknowingly providing the first, most crucial stepping stone for the empire he was destined to build on their legacy. Her father's wedding gift was an act of profound foresight, a gesture rooted in a deep understanding of human nature and the corrupting influence of power. He didn't write a check or offer a portfolio of stocks.
Instead, he summoned Laura to the hushed, mahogany-paneled office of his lifelong attorney, Mr. Albright. On the vast, polished desk lay a single formidable document, the deed of gift for the family mansion. With the lawyer as his witness, he explained that the property was being transferred into her name and her name alone as a separate and untouchable asset. "A man's fortune can rise and fall like the tide, my dear," her father said, his voice imbued with a quiet solemnity. "But this land, this home, this is your rock. It will keep you safe. It is not part of any marriage contract. It is a promise from me to you." At the time, Laura saw it as a touching, overly cautious expression of a father's love. She folded the document away, filed it in a safe deposit box, and barely gave it another thought, never imagining that this piece of paper was not just a safety net, but a sleeping giant of justice, waiting patiently for the day it would be called upon to awaken.
In the early years, their life was a whirlwind of shared purpose. While Richard poured his soul into building his company from the ground up, Laura became the architect of their life, transforming the stately but aging mansion into a vibrant hub of influence. She was the consummate hostess, her dinners becoming legendary among the city's financial elite. She could debate politics with a banker and discuss art with his wife, creating an atmosphere where multi-million-dollar deals were born over dessert and coffee. She managed the estate with an efficiency that would rival any corporate executive, ensuring that every dollar Richard earned could be funneled back into his growing business. She raised their two children almost single-handedly, instilling in them the quiet strength and integrity of her own family, a stark contrast to the cutthroat world their father was conquering. She was the unpaid, unacknowledged, and indispensable partner in his ascent. He saw the burgeoning bank accounts and the soaring stock prices as the measure of his success, completely oblivious to the fact that the entire structure was built upon the invisible, unshakable foundation she provided every single day. The transformation was gradual, a slow poisoning of the man she had loved. As Richard's net worth swelled into the hundreds of millions, his gratitude curdled into an insatiable arrogance. The story of their shared struggle was meticulously rewritten in his mind until he was the sole protagonist, a self-made titan who had bent the world to his will. Laura's role was diminished, then trivialized, and finally all but erased. He began to sneer at her family's old money sensibilities, mocking the very traditions and values that had once given him his start. The house was no longer their sanctuary. It was a relic he was eager to gut and remodel into a monument to his own modern taste. He started making cruel, offhand remarks designed to undermine her worth, criticizing her for not having a career of her own, for being content as just a housewife. He failed to see the supreme irony. Her full-time job had been the meticulous 25-year-long construction of the life that now enabled him to look down on her with such profound contempt. His family, who had once been grateful for the stability Laura provided, now became a chorus of sycophants reinforcing his inflated ego. His mother, in particular, took a cruel satisfaction in Laura's perceived obsolescence. At holiday dinners, she would praise Richard's unstoppable trajectory while casting pitying glances at Laura, suggesting she take up a hobby or do something with herself to keep from being left behind. Their social circle morphed from old family friends to a glittering, transient crowd of the newly rich, who judged a woman's worth by the size of her diamonds and the ruthlessness of her ambition. In their eyes, Laura was a ghost of a bygone era, a quiet, elegant woman completely out of her depth. Richard, rather than defending the woman who had stood by him when he had nothing, seemed to revel in their judgment. It validated the narrative he was constructing in his own mind, that he had evolved beyond her, and that leaving her was not an act of betrayal, but a necessary step in his personal and professional ascension. The emotional distance soon became a physical one. His workdays stretched into nights, his business trips became more frequent and less explained. A chilling emptiness began to settle in the spaces between them, a silence filled with unspoken suspicions. Laura started noticing the small, indelible signs of betrayal that every heartbroken spouse comes to recognize. The faint smell of a woman's perfume clinging to his coat, the furtive way he angled his phone away from her, the credit card statements with charges from high-end boutiques she had never set foot in. She tried to confront him once, her voice a fragile whisper in the vast, cold living room. He responded not with denial, but with indignation, expertly twisting her pain into a sign of her own weakness. "Don't you have anything better to do than invent these pathetic little dramas?" he sneered, his eyes cold and dismissive.
I'm out there making a fortune for us, and this is the thanks I get? You've become so needy, Laura. It's unattractive. He made her feel as though her intuition was a form of madness, a cruel gaslighting that left her questioning her own sanity. Jessica was the inevitable conclusion to his long campaign of disrespect. She was a weaponized cliché, young, stunningly beautiful, and possessing an ambition as naked and predatory as his own. He paraded her around like a trophy, a gleaming symbol of his power and virility. She was everything Laura wasn't, loud, flashy, and utterly unimpressed by history or legacy. Jessica saw the world as a marketplace, and Richard was the ultimate prize. She showered him with the kind of fawning adoration his ego desperately craved, validating his belief that he was a king who deserved a queen more suited to his station. The affair quickly became the worst-kept secret in their social circle, a topic of hushed gossip at every gala and charity event. Richard made no effort to hide it, a deliberate and public humiliation designed to break Laura's spirit completely.
He wanted her to feel the full weight of her replacement, to see her future being lived by another woman, forcing her to accept her own obsolescence before he had even bothered to formally end their marriage. His contempt became a daily performance. He began to micromanage her life, freezing her access to their joint accounts and forcing her to request money for basic household necessities, a demeaning ritual for the woman who had once managed the entire estate. He turned their adult children against her, painting her as a bitter, old-fashioned woman who couldn't accept his success, creating a painful division that shattered the family she had worked so hard to build. The ultimate violation came when he hired a famous architect to redesign the mansion, planning to tear down walls that held generations of her family's memories and replace them with cold expanses of glass and steel. He wanted to strip the home of its soul, to erase every trace of her existence until nothing remained but a hollow shell remade in his own image. This wasn't just a renovation, it was an act of cultural vandalism, a brutal attempt to destroy her past to make way for his future, a future in which she played no part. The breaking point arrived during a heated argument over the estate's sprawling back acreage, a pristine woodland her father had meticulously preserved. Richard announced he was selling it to a developer to build a gated community of soulless McMansions. Laura, horrified, reminded him of the solemn promise he had made to her dying father to protect that land forever. Richard's laughter was a chilling, hollow sound that filled the room. "Your father was a sentimental old fool who didn't understand progress," he said, gesturing dismissively at the portrait of her father that hung over the fireplace. "He's gone, Laura. He can't hold us back anymore. That land is a gold mine." It was in that moment she understood. He wasn't just breaking a promise, he was desecrating a sacred trust. He saw her history, her family, and her values as nothing more than obstacles to his greed. The love she once felt for him died completely, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. She realized that honoring her father's memory now required her to dismantle the arrogant world her husband had built. The week before he threw her out was the final act of this slow, agonizing execution of their marriage. He insisted she attend his company's annual awards gala, a command performance meant to maintain the illusion of a stable home life for his investors. Jessica was there, a glittering vulture seated at a prime table, and Richard orbited her all night, his every touch and smile a public declaration. But the most profound blow came during his keynote address. He stood on stage under the bright lights, thanking everyone who had contributed to his success, his partners, his board, even his first mentor. He spoke for 20 minutes, a soaring tribute to his own genius. He never mentioned her name, not once. In front of 500 people, he rendered 25 years of her life invisible. As the room erupted in applause, his eyes found hers. There was no shame, no apology. There was only a cold, triumphant glint of victory. He thought he had finally won, that he had successfully erased her from the story. He had no idea that he had just handed her the pen, and she was about to write a final chapter he would never see coming. The 2 hours Richard had allotted her were a cruel joke, a countdown to her own erasure. But the true, soul-crushing blow landed a week later. Richard hosted a lavish housewarming party in what was still, in every fiber of its being, her home. A friend, still loyal enough to be horrified, sent Laura a screenshot from a guest's social media story. There was Richard, raising a champagne flute, with Jessica clinging to his arm. The caption read, "To New Beginnings." In the video, he made a grand speech, gesturing around the familiar living room.
"This house has been in a long sleep," he declared to the applause of his new sycophantic friends, "but now it has a new heart, a new soul. I'm proud to officially give this home to the woman who inspires my future, not my past." He handed Jessica a ridiculously oversized, jewel-encrusted key, a prop for a game show, not a life. Laura stared at the image on her phone, the key a dagger twisting in her heart. He wasn't just replacing her, he was performing a public exorcism, casting out her spirit from the very walls that had absorbed her entire adult life. Her public status was the next thing to be systematically dismantled. For over a decade, Laura had served on the board of the city's most prestigious children's charity, a position her mother had held before her. It was a role she cherished, a connection to her family's legacy of philanthropy. A few days after the party, she received a cold, formal email from the board's chairman, a man she had considered a friend. It stated that due to a strategic rebranding, they were refreshing the board's image to align with a more dynamic, corporate-facing profile. The implication was brutally clear. She, the discarded wife, was no longer a brand asset. The message was Richard's, delivered by a coward's hand. He was methodically stripping away every piece of her identity that wasn't directly tied to him, ensuring she was left with nothing. He wanted to make her a non-person, a footnote in his biography.
The humiliation was profound, not because she cared for the title, but because he was so effortlessly poisoning the wells of her own history, turning her life's work into another casualty of his monumental ego. The cruelty of Richard's family was perhaps the most painful cut of all. His mother, who had once praised Laura for being the steadying force in her son's chaotic life, invited her to a Sunday brunch, a supposed olive branch. It was a trap. Surrounded by Richard's smirking siblings and their spouses, Laura was subjected to a carefully orchestrated tribunal. "You have to understand, Laura," his mother said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "Richard is a man of a certain caliber now. He needs a partner who can keep up, someone with vitality." His sister chimed in. "Honestly, what did you expect? You never even tried to build your own career. You can't blame him for wanting someone who is his equal." They spoke of her as if she were a failed investment, a stock that had ceased to perform. They laughed at her quiet dignity, mistaking it for weakness. She sat there, a solitary island in a sea of hostility, realizing that in their eyes, her 25 years of devotion were not a contribution, but a liability. She was no longer family. She was an obstacle to their continued enjoyment of Richard's wealth. A chance encounter in the city's most exclusive department store served as another calculated strike. Laura was picking up a small, comforting gift for herself when she saw Jessica gliding through the jewelry department, Richard's platinum card firmly in hand. Jessica spotted her, and instead of turning away, made a direct line for her, a predator's smile playing on her lips. "Laura, fancy seeing you here," she chirped, her voice loud enough for others to hear. Her eyes immediately dropped to Laura's left hand. "Is that your ring? It's classic." The word was delivered like an insult. Jessica then held up her own hand, flashing a diamond the size of a small planet, a cold, ostentatious stone that screamed of new money. "Richard says we should always look forward, not back. Out with the old, in with the new, right?" She winked, a gesture of such profound condescension that it stole the air from Laura's lungs. The simple, elegant band on Laura's finger, a symbol of vows and shared history, suddenly felt like a relic, a testament to a faith that had been brutally betrayed and was now being openly mocked by its replacement. The final family gathering she was ever invited to cemented her new, invisible status. It was her nephew's birthday, and she attended for the boy's sake, hoping for a sliver of normalcy. But she was treated not as an aunt, but as an unpaid servant. Richard's sister-in-law, without a hint of shame, handed her a tray of appetizers and said, "Laura, dear, could you pass these around? You're so good at this sort of thing." Later, when a child spilled a drink, all eyes turned to her, as if it were her duty to clean it up. Richard wasn't there, but his influence was a toxic gas filling the room, giving everyone permission to treat her as a pariah. She watched as Jessica was welcomed with hugs and laughter, seated in the place of honor at the table that should have been hers. Laura was relegated to a small chair in the corner, forgotten and ignored. The message was clear and unanimous. She had been demoted. She was no longer a matriarch of this family. She was a ghost haunting the edges of their new, brighter reality, a reality she had helped build, and from which she was now completely exiled. The financial strangulation was swift and merciless.
Richard had always managed their finances, a detail she had once seen as a sign of his care, but now understood as a tool of control. The corporate card he had tossed her was a leash, not a lifeline. He had programmed it with a ridiculously low daily limit, enough for a sterile hotel room and cheap meals, but not enough for dignity. The ultimate humiliation came at a small cafe where she was trying to buy a simple cup of coffee. The card was declined. The young barista looked at her with pity as she fumbled in her purse, her cheeks burning with shame. She had just enough cash to cover it, but the public rejection was devastating. It was Richard, from his glass tower office, sending a clear message. "You have nothing that I don't allow you to have. You are completely at my mercy." He wanted her to feel the cold, hard terror of absolute dependency, to break her spirit by reminding her with every small, failed transaction that she was, in his world, utterly powerless and penniless without him. His psychological campaign was just as relentless. He would call her at odd hours, his voice a sickening blend of false concern and condescending authority. "Laura, I'm hearing things," he'd begin. "People are saying you're not handling this well. You need to pull yourself together. Crying in public isn't a good look." He was twisting the knife, using the very pain he was inflicting as evidence of her instability. He framed his monstrous cruelty as a rational business decision. "This isn't personal, it's just an upgrade. The company of my life needed a new CEO, that's all. You should be grateful for the generous severance package I'm offering." He spoke of their marriage as if it were a corporate merger that had run its course.
He gaslit her, telling her that her memories of their happier times were sentimental delusions, and that she was the one who had let herself go, who had failed to evolve. He was trying to rewrite history, to convince her that her own heartbreak was her own fault, a final, insidious act of emotional violence. The deepest wound, however, was inflicted by her own children. Her son, now a junior executive in Richard's company, called her not with words of comfort, but with a rehearsed speech. "Mom, Dad told me everything. I think you need to be realistic about this. He's a different person now, and fighting him is only going to make it harder for everyone, especially for us." Her daughter, who was planning a lavish wedding funded entirely by Richard, was even more direct. "Please don't create a scene, Mom. Jessica is actually really nice once you get to know her. Dad is happy. Can't you just be happy for him?" The words were like acid, dissolving the last vestiges of her hope. Richard hadn't just taken her husband, he had stolen her children, turning them into his mouthpieces, forcing her to choose between her dignity and her relationship with them. They saw her pain as an inconvenience, a disruption to the flow of money and status that their father provided. In that moment, Laura felt a loneliness so profound it was a physical ache, a cold void where a family used to be. She finally hit the bottom in a small, impersonal furnished apartment that Richard had rented for her, a place with no memories and no soul. For days, she did nothing but stare at the beige walls, the weight of her erasure pressing down on her until she could barely breathe. Every humiliation replayed in her mind, the mocking laughter, the pitying stares, the casual cruelty. She looked in the mirror and saw a stranger, a pale, defeated woman with haunted eyes. This was his masterpiece. He had taken a vibrant, intelligent, loving woman and hollowed her out, leaving nothing but a shell of grief and shame. She felt utterly worthless, a disposable object that had been used up and thrown away. The thought of disappearing, of simply ceasing to exist, flickered in her mind, a tempting escape from a pain that felt unsurvivable. This was the victory Richard wanted. He wanted her broken, silent, and gone. And for a terrifying moment, sitting in the suffocating silence of that beige room, she felt herself on the verge of giving him exactly what he desired. But then, as she sat there in the deepest pit of her despair, something flickered to life. It started as a tiny ember of defiance in the ashes of her heart. She thought of her father, of the strength in his eyes when he had handed her that leather folio all those years ago. "This is your rock," he had said. She remembered the solemn promise she had made to him and the promise she had made to herself. The tears stopped. A cold, clear anger, pure and hard as diamond, began to replace the grief. She realized that her sorrow was a luxury she could no longer afford. It was the very thing that fueled Richard's triumph. He was counting on her to break. He was expecting her to fade away quietly. And in that instant, a new resolve settled over her. She would not be erased.
She would not be a ghost in her own story. She rose from the chair, her back straight for the first time in weeks. She walked over to the phone, her movements calm and deliberate. She knew exactly who she needed to call. The war was not over. In fact, it had just begun. Her first call was not to a friend or a family member, but to a name that felt like an anchor to a more honorable time, Mr. Albright. The memory of his office was a sanctuary in her mind, a stark contrast to the cold, impersonal world Richard had built. It was a place of dark wood, worn leather, and the quiet rustle of important papers, a place where integrity was not a commodity, but a cornerstone. She dialed the number from memory, her hand trembling slightly, but her voice, when she spoke, was unexpectedly steady. "Mr. Albright," she began, "it's Laura Monroe. Laura Collins, that is. I need to see you. It's about my father's house." There was no surprise in his voice, only a calm, paternal warmth that instantly soothed a fraction of her frayed nerves. "Of course, my dear," he replied, his tone suggesting he had been half expecting this call for years. "Come tomorrow morning. We have much to discuss." The simple exchange was a lifeline, pulling her out of the suffocating paralysis of her grief and setting her feet on the first solid ground she had felt in weeks. She wasn't just making an appointment, she was activating a legacy. Stepping into Mr. Albright's office was like stepping back in time, into a world governed by principles Richard would have sneered at as outdated. The air smelled of aged paper and lemon polish, and the only sounds were the ticking of a grandfather clock and the faint hum of the city outside. Mr. Albright, a man whose tailored tweed jacket seemed as timeless as the legal tomes lining his walls, greeted her not with pity, but with a quiet, respectful solemnity. He poured her a cup of tea, his movements unhurried, and then simply waited. He gave her the space to tell her story, from the click of Jessica's heels on her marble floor to the final soul-crushing humiliation of the declined credit card. He listened without interruption, his sharp, intelligent eyes missing nothing, his hands steepled under his chin.
He saw not the broken woman Richard had tried to create, but the resilient daughter of his old friend, a woman whose quiet dignity was being tested by a profound and vulgar injustice. When she finished, her voice raw with unshed tears, he didn't offer condolences. He offered something far better, a solution. With a gravity that felt ceremonial, Mr. Albright rose from his chair and walked to a large, unassuming landscape painting hanging on the wall. He swung it aside to reveal the heavy, black iron door of a vintage safe. After a few precise turns of the dial, he opened it and withdrew a thick, leather-bound folio, its surface softened with age. He placed it gently on the polished desk between them, the soft thud echoing in the quiet room. "Your father, Laura, was not just a good man, he was a brilliant one. He understood that the greatest fortunes are not always measured in dollars, but in foresight." He untied the delicate ribbon and opened the folio. There it was, the original deed of gift for the Monroe estate, executed and filed a full year before her wedding. The language was clear, unequivocal, and legally airtight. The property had been transferred to Laura Elizabeth Collins as her sole and separate property. Mr. Albright let her absorb the weight of the words. "Richard never owned that house, my dear. He has been, for 25 years, a guest, and a profoundly ungrateful one at that." A single tear escaped Laura's eye, but it was not a tear of sorrow. It was a tear of vindication, of a truth so powerful it seemed to realign her very soul. She ran her fingers over her name, the elegant script a testament to her father's love and wisdom. Every ounce of shame, every feeling of worthlessness Richard had so carefully inflicted upon her, began to evaporate under the stark legal reality of this document. It was her rock, just as her father had promised. To solidify the moment, Mr. Albright slid another paper across the desk, a freshly printed title report from the county recorder's office, dated that very morning. "Just to be thorough," he said with the ghost of a smile. "Ownership, Laura Collins Monroe. No liens, no encumbrances, no co-owners." The power shift was palpable, a seismic event happening in the silent, wood-paneled office. Richard's empire, his grand pronouncements, his public gifting of her house to his mistress, it was all a sham, a fantasy built on a foundation of pure, unadulterated arrogance. He wasn't a king, he was a squatter. The path forward suddenly became brilliantly clear. Laura's first instinct was to file for divorce immediately, to drag him through a messy public legal battle where this deed would be her trump card.
but Mr. Albright gently steered her towards a more refined, more impactful strategy. A lawsuit is a war of attrition, Laura. It would give him time to spin the narrative, to play the victim, to hide other assets. It would be a prolonged, ugly affair. He leaned forward, his eyes glinting with a strategist's fire. Why engage in a war for a territory you already command? We don't need a judge's permission to ask an unwanted guest to leave your property. We simply need to serve him notice. A direct, decisive, and legally unimpeachable action is what is required here. We will not ask for the house back. We will take it back. The idea was breathtaking in its audacity. It wasn't revenge in the traditional sense. It was a restoration of order, an act of justice so swift and clean it would leave Richard no room to maneuver, no time to save face. It was perfect. The following days were a blur of focused, clandestine activity. Laura moved into Mr. Albright's discreet guest house, a place where no one would think to look for her. The law office became her command center. While Mr. Albright meticulously prepared the legal documents, a formal notice to vacate that was both polite and terrifyingly final, Laura became the architect of the operation. She drew a detailed floor plan of the mansion from memory, marking the locations of security panels, circuit breakers, and all points of entry. She provided the names and schedules of the household staff, ensuring they could be discreetly informed and protected when the time came. Mr. Albright, meanwhile, hired a security team not from a standard agency, but a boutique firm specializing in asset recovery for the ultra-wealthy. Their personnel were former special forces, men who radiated an unshakable authority that no amount of blustering from a furious CEO could penetrate. Every detail was planned with the precision of a military operation, all while Richard remained blissfully unaware, celebrating a victory that had already been rendered void. Richard's arrogance provided the perfect cover for their preparations. He interpreted Laura's silence not as a sign of strength, but as proof of her complete and utter defeat. When he received a terse, formal letter from Albright and Associates, informing them that they were representing his wife, he laughed out loud. He saw it as a desperate, pathetic gesture. He immediately called Laura, his voice dripping with condescending amusement in the voicemail he left. "Really, Laura? Albright? That old fossil hasn't seen a real courtroom in 30 years. Don't be a fool. My lawyers will bury him."
Just take the generous offer I made and try to have some dignity. He then went on to describe a lavish trip he was planning with Jessica to the Amalfi Coast, a final twist of the knife to remind her of the life she had lost. Every word he spoke only strengthened Laura's resolve. He saw a broken toy, not a coiled serpent. He was so busy admiring his reflection in the spoils of a war he thought he'd won that he failed to notice the ground crumbling beneath his feet. On the final night before executing their plan, Laura stood by the window of the guest house, looking out at the city lights. The briefcase containing her future sat on the table beside her. Inside was the deed, the title report, and the notice that would dismantle Richard's world. A profound calm had settled over her, a quiet certainty that replaced all the fear and doubt. This was no longer about a man or a marriage. It was about honoring a father's protective love. It was about reclaiming a history that Richard had tried to bulldoze. It was about proving to herself that her worth was not something that could be given or taken away by a man, but was an intrinsic part of her heritage, written in ink and sealed by law. She thought of Richard not with hatred, but with a kind of clinical pity for his blindness. He had mistaken her kindness for weakness, and her silence for surrender. Tomorrow, he would learn the difference. Tomorrow, she would walk through her front door, not as a ghost of the past, but as the undisputed master of the house. While Richard was confidently orchestrating the public demolition of their shared history, Laura was silently rebuilding her own future on a foundation of unshakable truth. His days were a whirlwind of high-stakes meetings with his legal team, a pack of corporate sharks who specialized in scorched earth divorces. He instructed them to be merciless, to offer Laura a settlement so insultingly low it would force her into a quick and quiet surrender. "She has no stomach for a fight," he boasted to his lead attorney over a lunch of steak and expensive wine. "She's been living in my world for so long she won't know how to survive outside of it. Just bury her in paperwork." He saw her hiring of Mr. Albright as a quaint, pathetic gesture, a retreat into the sentimental past he was so eager to erase. He was a man playing chess against an opponent he believed had already forfeited the game, moving his pieces with a theatrical arrogance that blanded him to the board itself, completely unaware that he was already in checkmate. In stark contrast to Richard's loud aggression, Laura's days were governed by a quiet, methodical purpose. The guest house at Mr. Albright's estate had transformed from a refuge into a war room, its antique writing desk covered not with tear-stained tissues, but with legal pads filled with timelines, property maps, and lists of assets.
She rose each morning at dawn, her mind sharp and clear for the first time in years. The fog of grief had lifted, replaced by the cold, exhilarating clarity of a singular mission. She spent hours with Mr. Albright, poring over decades of financial records she had meticulously kept, unearthing every instance where Richard had acknowledged the house as her family's legacy. She was no longer the shrinking, invisible wife. She was a forensic accountant of her own life, tracing the lines of his deceit with the precision of a surgeon. Her silence was not weakness. It was the focused quiet of a predator gathering its strength, waiting for the perfect moment to strike its unsuspecting prey. One of her most crucial missions was a discreet trip to the county recorder's office, a cavernous, marble-floored building that smelled of dust and permanence. Dressed in a simple trench coat and sunglasses, she was just another anonymous citizen navigating the slow, deliberate pace of bureaucracy. But in her hands, she held the power to unravel Richard's entire world. She requested certified copies of the original deed of gift, the property tax records for the last 25 years, all paid from a trust her father had established, and the historical surveys of the land. The clerk, a kindly woman with tired eyes, stamped each document with a heavy, satisfying thud, the official seal imprinting a mark of undeniable legal authority. Laura placed the thick manila envelope into her briefcase, the weight of the papers a tangible reassurance of her father's foresight. Richard built his empire on contracts and leveraged buyouts, but this simple, unassailable piece of history was a currency his money could never devalue or acquire. Richard, meanwhile, encountered the first faint tremor of his impending earthquake, but his ego was too massive to register it. His lead attorney called him with a minor point of confusion. "Richard, there's a slight anomaly on the preliminary title search for the estate," the lawyer said, his voice cautious. "The property was deeded to Laura Collins a year before the marriage, listed as a gift. It was never formally transferred into a joint marital asset." Richard let out a dismissive laugh that echoed in his sterile, glass-walled office. "That was just a tax dodge by his old man. It's a technicality. We've lived there our entire marriage, poured millions into its upkeep. It's marital property by any sane definition. Just find a loophole, intimidation, whatever it takes. That's what I pay you for." He hung up the phone, irritated by the interruption.
The warning sign, clear as day to a legal professional, was utterly invisible to a man who believed his will alone was powerful enough to bend reality and even the law to his liking. Laura's strategy extended far beyond simply reclaiming her home. She was methodically insulating her entire future. With Mr. Albright's guidance, she established a carefully structured blind trust, moving her own inherited assets, a modest but significant portfolio her father had left her, into a vehicle that made them legally invisible to Richard's prying lawyers. This was not just a defensive move, it was the foundation for an offensive one. She learned that Richard was planning to sell the pristine woodland behind the mansion to a ruthless developer. Using her trust, she made a quiet, anonymous offer to the elderly couple who owned a small but critical access road to that land, paying well above market value. Without that access, the development project would be tied up in legal and logistical knots for years, rendering it virtually worthless. Richard was busy trying to steal her past, completely oblivious to the fact that she was systematically buying up and dismantling his future. Jessica, for her part, was the perfect catalyst for Richard's self-destructive hubris. Drunk on her newfound status, she spent her days on a whirlwind tour of designer boutiques and exclusive showrooms, redesigning a life she believed was now hers. She encouraged Richard's every cruel impulse, her laughter echoing his own when he recounted his plans to leave Laura with next to nothing. "She deserves it," Jessica would purr, tracing the lapel of his expensive suit. "She never appreciated what she had." They threw an intimate dinner party for a select group of their new friends, where Richard, emboldened by champagne and adoration, made a grand public toast. "To this house," he declared, raising his glass towards the grand staircase, "which will soon be the official home of its true queen." He was so caught up in the performance of his victory, so enamored with the reflection of his own power in Jessica's eyes, that he failed to notice he was making a public promise about a property he had absolutely no authority to give away. The final element of Laura's plan was the human one. She met with the director of the security firm Mr. Albright had retained, a former military intelligence officer named Marcus Thorne. He was a man who radiated an aura of quiet competence and unshakable calm. He listened intently as Laura explained the situation, his expression revealing neither judgment nor surprise. This was not a messy domestic dispute to him. It was a tactical operation with a clear objective. "Our goal is a peaceful and orderly transition of control, Mrs. Monroe," he stated, his voice a low, steady baritone. "We are not here to intimidate. We are here to enforce a legal and rightful claim. My team will ensure your safety and secure the premises with absolute professionalism." They synchronized their watches, reviewed the floor plans, and confirmed the protocols.
As Laura left the meeting, she felt a profound sense of security. She was not just fighting with the law on her side, she was fighting with a disciplined, unmovable force at her back. The trap was baited with a piece of paper so mundane, so bureaucratic, that Richard couldn't possibly see the danger it represented. Mr. Albright's office dispatched a formal letter via courier to Richard's legal team. It was a masterpiece of understated language, proposing a brief on-site meeting at the Monroe estate in 2 days' time to conduct a preliminary inventory of personal effects and tangible assets to facilitate a smoother division of property. It sounded like a tedious but necessary step, a sign that Laura was preparing to negotiate her surrender. Richard's lawyer passed the message on, and Richard agreed without a moment's hesitation. He saw it as his final victory lap, a chance to watch Laura walk through his house one last time, cataloging the life she had lost. "Of course," he told his lawyer, a triumphant smirk in his voice. "Tell them to be here at 2 o'clock sharp. Jessica and I will be here to supervise." He hung up, imagining the defeated look on Laura's face. On the morning of the designated day, the atmosphere in the mansion was one of smug celebration. Richard stood on the grand balcony overlooking the gardens, a cup of expensive coffee in his hand, Jessica beside him. He felt like a king surveying his kingdom, the final remnants of the old regime about to be swept away. He rehearsed the condescending, magnanimous speech he would give Laura, a final performance of his power. Miles away, in the quiet solitude of the guest house, Laura was also preparing. She fastened the clasp of her grandmother's pearl necklace, a symbol of quiet, enduring strength. She slipped into the tailored navy blue power suit that was her armor. There was no fear in her eyes, only a steely resolve. When Mr. Albright arrived, he found her perfectly composed, the leather folio containing her father's promise resting on the table beside her. As their car pulled away, heading towards the tree-lined driveway of her home, the security team moved silently into position, invisible observers waiting for the moment when justice would finally ring the doorbell.
The chime of the doorbell echoed through the cavernous foyer, a sound Richard Monroe had programmed to play a soft classical melody, a subtle announcement of his refined taste. He opened the heavy mahogany door with a flourish, a glass of champagne in his hand, ready to dismiss whoever had interrupted his afternoon celebration with Jessica. The sight of Laura, flanked by 2 imposing men, froze the triumphant smirk on his face. "What is the meaning of this?" he sputtered, his voice a low growl of disbelief and fury. He tried to slam the door, a petty assertion of the control he believed was absolute, but a firm, unmovable hand from one of the security guards stopped the heavy wood dead in its tracks. "This is my house," he bellowed, his face turning a blotchy red. "You are trespassing. I'm calling the police." Laura simply watched him, her expression a mask of serene neutrality. She didn't need to shout. Her silence was an indictment, a calm space in the storm of his rage. And in that silence, he felt the first terrifying tremor of a world about to be upended. His immediate instinct was to perform, to reinforce his power through a public display of dominance. He pulled out his phone, stabbing at the screen with a trembling finger, and put his lead attorney on speakerphone. "David, you're not going to believe this," he barked, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "Laura is here with a couple of hired thugs trying to intimidate me. I want you to file for a restraining order immediately and prepare a lawsuit for harassment and trespassing. We're going to bury her." He glanced up the grand staircase, where Jessica now stood, a vision in silk, her face a mixture of confusion and amusement. "Don't you worry, darling," Richard announced, projecting his voice for her benefit. "Just a pathetic last-ditch effort from a woman who can't accept she's been replaced. We'll have this trash removed from the property in minutes." He was playing to his audience, utterly confident in his script, unaware that the entire play had been rewritten, and he was no longer the star, but the fool. It was then that Laura finally moved. She took a single, deliberate step into the foyer, the click of her heels on the marble floor, a sound as definitive as a judge's gavel. She didn't respond to his threats or acknowledge his lawyer's tinny voice crackling from the phone. Instead, she extended a hand, holding a single, crisply folded document. From behind her, the timeless figure of Mr. Albright emerged, his presence lending an immediate and profound gravity to the scene. He nodded respectfully to Richard, his expression one of mild disappointment, as if observing a child's tantrum. "Mr. Monroe," he began, his voice calm and resonant, cutting through Richard's bluster. "We are not here to negotiate or to intimidate. We are simply here to deliver a notice." The atmosphere in the foyer shifted instantly. The air, once charged with Richard's chaotic rage,
now crackled with the cold, clear energy of legal finality. The balance of power was no longer tilting, it was in a free fall. Richard snatched the document from her hand, his arrogance momentarily overriding his growing unease. He unfolded it with a theatrical flourish, intending to mock its contents. "A notice to vacate?" he read aloud, his voice dripping with incredulous sarcasm. "Pursuant to the laws of this state, you are hereby notified to quit and deliver up possession of the premises." He let out a harsh, barking laugh, a sound that held no genuine humor. "You're evicting me from my house? The house I've poured millions into?" He waved the paper dismissively, turning to Jessica as if sharing a private joke. "Can you believe the nerve?" But Jessica's answering smile was strained, her eyes darting from the unreadable faces of the security guards to the quiet, dignified posture of Mr. Albright. For the first time, a seed of doubt had been planted in her perfectly manicured world. The scene was not playing out as she had imagined. This didn't feel like the desperate act of a scorned woman. It felt like a corporate takeover. Mr. Albright, unfazed by the display, calmly reached into his leather briefcase and produced a second, thicker document. "Perhaps this will provide some necessary clarification," he said, handing the file to Richard. Richard's eyes scanned the first page, his mocking expression slowly dissolving into a mask of pure, slack-jawed horror. The legal jargon was dense, but one line stood out with brutal, undeniable clarity. "Sole legal owner, Laura Elizabeth Collins. Date of transfer, October 12, 1998. Mr. Albright's voice was a quiet, devastating final nail. "The property was an irrevocable gift to Miss Collins from her father, a full year before your marriage. It was never a marital asset. Legally, Mr. Monroe, you have been a guest in your wife's home for the past 25 years, and your invitation has just been rescinded." The champagne glass slipped from Richard's nerveless fingers, shattering on the marble floor and echoing the sound of his world breaking apart. The full, catastrophic weight of his arrogance crashed down upon him.
He saw it all in a sickening, instant replay. His own lawyer's cautious mention of a slight anomaly on the title search, his dismissive laughter, his confident assertion that his money could bend any reality to his will. He had been so focused on rewriting the future that he had never bothered to read the fine print of the past. He looked at Laura, and for the first time, he didn't see the quiet, compliant wife he had so easily discarded. He saw a stranger, a woman of terrifying patience and strategic brilliance, who had been holding the ultimate trump card all along. His gaze flickered to Jessica, who was already backing away towards the stairs, her face a mask of cold fury. The dream she had bought into was a fraud, and the man who had sold it to her was not a king in his castle, but a trespasser about to be thrown out onto the street. The lawyer's voice, still crackling from the phone on the floor, was now a frantic squawk. "Richard? Richard, what does it say? The deed was separate property? My God, you never told me!" The professional bravado was gone, replaced by the naked panic of an attorney who had just been led off a cliff by his own client's hubris. Richard, in a final, pathetic surge of defiance, let out a primal roar of denial. "This is my home. I paid for these walls, this furniture. I will not be thrown out by you." He lunged forward, not at Laura, but towards the front door, a desperate, animalistic instinct to physically expel the truth that was destroying him. He was a man trying to hold back the tide with his bare hands, a futile and tragic spectacle of a power that had always been an illusion. The two security guards moved with the fluid, synchronized grace of true professionals. They didn't lay a hand on him. They simply stepped into his path, their broad shoulders and unwavering stances forming an impenetrable human wall. Marcus Thorne, the team's leader, spoke for the first time, his voice a low, steady baritone that carried no emotion but absolute finality. "Mr. Monroe, we are here to ensure a peaceful and orderly transition of control. You can gather your personal effects with dignity, or we can ask the local police to come and enforce the legal owner's rights. The choice is entirely yours, but make no mistake, you will be leaving the premises today." The mere mention of police, of flashing lights and public humiliation on his perfectly manicured lawn was the final blow. All the fight went out of him. He sagged against a marble column, utterly and completely defeated, the legal documents that sealed his fate scattered at his feet like fallen leaves. Laura walked past him without a second glance,
Her movements were unhurried as she moved through the foyer, her home. She ignored the panicked whispers of Jessica on the phone, likely arranging her own swift departure. Instead, Laura's gaze settled on the oil portrait of her father hanging above the grand fireplace, a silent conversation passing between them. She ran her hand along the cool, polished wood of the banister, a simple gesture of reclamation, of coming home. Finally, she turned to Mr. Albright and her security team. "Thank you," she said, her voice perfectly clear and unwavering. "Please escort Mr. Monroe and his guest while they pack what is theirs. They have 1 hour to vacate the property." The power had not just been reversed, it had been restored to its rightful place. She had not sought revenge, she had simply enforced the truth, and in the quiet, unassailable light of that truth, Richard's gilded kingdom of arrogance and deceit had crumbled into nothing. The hour that followed was a masterclass in quiet, systematic dismantling. Under the watchful, impassive eyes of Marcus Thorne's security team, Richard Monroe, the titan of industry, was reduced to a man hastily stuffing designer suits and golf trophies into cardboard boxes. Each item he packed was a relic of a life he now realized had been built on borrowed ground. Jessica, seeing her future evaporate, wasted no time on sentiment. She packed her own bags with a cold, furious efficiency, her stiletto heels clicking a frantic retreat on the marble floors. She didn't offer Richard a single word of comfort or support. Her allegiance had been to the mansion and the status it conferred, not the man. As Richard's luxury sedan, now looking less like a symbol of power and more like a getaway car, pulled down the long driveway, he could see the curtains of neighboring estates twitching. The news of his public eviction would spread through their exclusive community like wildfire, not as a tragedy, but a delicious piece of gossip about a man whose arrogance had finally, spectacularly caught up with him. He had been thrown out of his own kingdom, and the drawbridge had been raised behind him for good. The fallout was immediate and catastrophic, extending far beyond the manicured lawns of his former neighborhood. The story, leaked with perfect precision, appeared on a popular high society blog the very next morning, framed not as a messy divorce, but as the epic blunder of a corporate giant. The headline was devastatingly simple: CEO Richard Monroe evicted from wife's historic estate. The narrative painted him not as a ruthless shark, but as an incompetent fool who hadn't bothered to read the deed to his own home. His business partners, men who revered his supposed foresight, were horrified.
If he could be so blind to a detail of this magnitude in his personal life, what other fatal oversights existed in their shared ventures? His company's stock took a noticeable dip as investors questioned the stability of a leader whose judgment was so profoundly flawed. The carefully constructed image of Richard Monroe, the self-made visionary, the master of his universe, shattered overnight, replaced by the caricature of a man so blinded by his own reflection that he failed to see the cliff edge right beneath his feet. His family, who had so eagerly participated in Laura's humiliation, found themselves caught in the blast radius of his downfall. His mother, who had preached about the importance of a partner who could keep up, was now the subject of pitying whispers in her social circles, the mother of the man who was publicly outsmarted by the wife she had belittled. Richard's children were forced into a painful reckoning. His daughter's fiancé's family, old money like Laura's, began to quietly distance themselves, uncomfortable with the scandal. His son, an executive in Richard's company, had to walk through an office filled with employees who now knew his father's power was a fragile facade. Richard, who had commanded loyalty through a combination of fear and financial reward, found himself utterly alone. The sycophants who had toasted his new beginning were suddenly unavailable, their calls going unanswered. He had built an empire of transactional relationships, and with his primary asset gone, he was left with nothing but the echoing silence of his colossal mistake. Back at the mansion, Laura moved with a quiet, restorative grace. Her first act was not one of celebration, but of honor. She called the architect Richard had hired to gut her home, and with polite finality, canceled the contract. Her second call was to a local land conservancy. She began the process of placing the pristine woodland her father had cherished into a permanent protected trust, ensuring no developer could ever touch it. It was a fulfillment of the promise Richard had so callously broken. She walked through the rooms, not as a conqueror, but as a caretaker returning to her post. The oppressive air of Richard's ambition and Jessica's cheap perfume began to dissipate, replaced by the familiar scent of lemon oil and old books. She found Maria, the housekeeper, in the kitchen and simply said, "It's good to be home." The tears in the older woman's eyes were a testament to a loyalty that Richard's money could never buy. Laura wasn't just taking back a house, she was reclaiming its soul. Weeks later,
A humbled and desperate Richard sent a new divorce settlement offer through his beleaguered attorneys. It was a complete capitulation, offering Laura a staggering percentage of his company and a lifetime of alimony in exchange for a non-disclosure agreement. He was trying to buy her silence, to salvage what little was left of his reputation. Sitting in Mr. Albright's office, Laura reviewed the offer and slid it back across the desk. "I don't want his company," she stated, her voice calm and clear. She drafted a counteroffer that was not about money but about justice. She demanded he personally fund a new wing for the children's charity he had forced her from, dedicated to her father. She also required him to place the full amount of their children's inheritance into an independent trust, severing his ability to use money as a tool of manipulation forever. He had no choice but to accept. His final attempt to control the narrative had failed. Instead, he was forced to publicly fund her legacy and relinquish his power over the family he had tried to break. On a quiet evening months later, Laura sat in her father's favorite armchair in the library, a crackling fire casting a warm glow on the leather-bound books that lined the walls. The house was no longer a battlefield. It was a sanctuary, a place of peace and continuity. She had not sold it, nor had she filled it with new things. She had simply allowed it to be itself again. Her children, their eyes finally opened, were slowly finding their way back to her, rebuilding a relationship based on newfound respect rather than financial dependency. She picked up a framed photograph from the table, a picture of her as a young woman, standing with her father on the very lawn Richard had tried to steal. She smiled, a genuine, serene expression of a woman who had not sought revenge, but had simply demanded the truth. Richard Monroe had believed he could rewrite history by tearing out the pages he didn't like, forgetting that a true legacy is not a story you tell, but a foundation you build. And he was now a man with no foundation left at all.